Okay.
This next one will probably show that not all of these are quite as difficult as the previous one.
I hope so. We'll see.
Okay. Ms. Messer.
The next one, line item number 2, has to do with Delta Plan implementation and the implementation committee. Comments were received on the 5th draft plan, primarily through the Ag Urban Plan and from water agencies. We also received comments related to these this subheading from the Independent Science Board and the Delta Protection Commission in their proposal. The comments were pertinent to Chapter 3, and they were comments that kind of spoke to different sections within the chapter as a whole. And the theme that we've rolled this up into is the comments express concerns that the draft plan overemphasizes the regulatory role of the Council, does not address the facilitation, coordination, and oversight roles as adequately. There were also concerns expressed over the lack of information regarding interagency coordination, roles, and collaboration, and mention of implementing agencies as well. So what staff did in looking at these various comments was that we did agree with the comments, and we're proposing the following 3 changes. The first bullet point is the first proposed change, and that would be to expand the description in Chapter 3, the governance chapter, and throughout other appropriate parts within the draft plan of the Council's role in achieving the co-equal goals and the importance of coordination and collaboration in that process. So essentially bringing more balance to not only describing the regulatory role, but also facilitation and coordination, and to have those emphasized as equally. We also are proposing to add more detailed language, and I apologize, we don't have the language here, but we'll work on that, regarding the implementation committee, and that is per Water Code Section 85204, and we'll describe the role in which they will play in coordinating the implementation of the Delta Plan. The third change that we're proposing to make, potentially make in the 6th draft, is to add in additional language and description of the other implementing agencies and their roles and their responsibilities in implementing the Delta Plan, and doing that based on subject area, so water supply reliability, ecosystem restoration.
Could you explain that? I mean, I read it and I said, I think it's okay, but I'm not quite sure pick an agency and ramble on what a description might look like.
Jeez. DWR, possibly.
Okay.
I'm not sure I can ramble very much about.
I
but
give you, since I'm the one that's working on Chapter 8, one of the pieces of advice we heard from the Delta Protection Commission was you should recognize our role and the role of local governments in protecting the Delta's place. And so we would craft language that would include a paragraph about how the statutory role that's provided to the Delta Protection Commission in the Delta Reform Act, the role of local governments, and how those decisions relate to the Council's authorities as well. You might do the same thing in the section on water quality, where you would have a little information about the Water Board's responsibility and the Regional Board's responsibilities for setting water quality policy and standards, and for the regulation of discharges.
I think there's much greater clarity with the Delta Protection Commission as a geographically not identical, but close area. How would you describe on implementing this is an implementation committee of the Delta Plan, right?
Yes.
Yes, and it's required in statute.
I understand. I understand that. Do you believe that the duties of, and in this case, state agencies, whether DWR or anybody, include a duty to the co-equal goals and the inherent objectives?
Sure, all state agencies are responsible for carrying out the law, and what we've tried to do is go through in each chapter and identify within this topical area, these are the state agencies that are responsible, these are the federal partners who they'll be working with, and so when we identify who ought to be in the implementation committee, it's derived from those responsibilities.
Don.
Just on this one, then, would you, we talked about the council being the facilitator or coordinator, but would it be the convener that would call parties together either on a regular basis or an as-needed basis? I think even to Cindy's example, DWR, but they were here this morning, and I think not only the conversations and reports to the council, but I think on either things that have been legislated and or initiatives that have been taken, either part of the Delta Plan and or related efforts, it seemed to me that, providing some definition beyond being the regulator as in helping facilitate, again, you need lots of different words, but to really emphasize the role of this council working through the implementation committee, but also convening, and not just calling forward on and asking folks to come here, but it may be bringing several discrete agencies and or entities together, and they could be from different elements of government, state, federal, and local, around a particular problem, around a particular effort in the plan, an issue, and maybe some ongoing things, because discussions about flows and flow objectives and adaptive management and all those things will evolve over time. I just think that this body, though, could be could really take on that added emphasis, because I think the things that are vested in law, the responsibilities of this council, to bring people together and hopefully where they may be doing their good work and working in concert with a plan, but still not necessarily talking to one another, because they're entities that have certain charges and they're off busy doing what they need to do. So I just maybe that's embedded in body what you're thinking about bringing forward, but I would just offer that as a suggestion that I think that could certainly help advance things in the years to come.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah. We were anticipating that the implementation committee would be a standing committee of the heads of the key agencies that were involved in the Delta or their representatives, and that it could convene work groups of various kinds to deal with specific problems, whether it was coordinating their regulatory action on a big project or trying to work through a set of issues that are connected to each other. And those might come and go while the standing committee, the implementation committee, would be there year after year to bring together top executives.
Randy.
I want to support that concept and point out that in about 2004, 2005, when the Little Hoover Commission did their evaluation of CalFed, their biggest criticism was that there was a lack of action because of engagement at the highest levels of government. And I think since the statute's not very specific about the implementation committee, you have a lot of latitude to describe what it ought to look like. And then we can react to that and tell you, we think you're on the right track or not. But getting the heads of agencies tied in to this process is critical. And if you haven't read the executive summary of that Little Hoover Commission report, I'd urge everyone in the audience to read it. It ought to be one of our guiding documents.
Okay. Gloria, then Felicia. Yeah.
My comment, really. I think this is probably the most important part of the plan, and I'll tell you why. Because I think this chapter, which naturally has to do with governance, really sets the tone for the rest of the plan. It really kind of tells us what the plan should be all about. And I think this council has to decide, are we regulatory, or are we, do we collaborate, or do we facilitate, what our role really is. And so I like the idea of the options that Felicia came up with, that there should be options that tell us what staff thinks the language should be. And I know you haven't really put language to these suggestions, but to give us language. But also I think an option should be, what was the overriding theme or language that folks sent in that they thought should be changed here? Because I think that should be part of the option. I see where you have ag, herb, plan, and water agencies. Did they send in any language to suggest for this area?
Dan's looking for
big pile of paper Mr. Ray
Yeah,
is thumbing through is kind of a compendium
of comments.
the 5,000 pages of comments.
No, their language wasn't as specific as we would have liked, but the concepts were clear.
Yeah. So maybe if you can summarize it and show us that was there, and this is what staff thinks should be there, so the council at least have the opportunity to kind of see what other folks are thinking and then what staff is thinking. The other thing is that I really think that this chapter should say what will happen after the plan is implemented. I know you talked about an implementation committee, which are the head agencies, but what role will the council play in that implementation committee? Will it be an oversight to kind of prod or encourage agencies to do whatever? The other thing is that, and this may not be the part, but I do want to say this, that after the plan is adopted, I think we should have some place in the plan or some place understood that there will be questions after this plan is done, and that I think we should have some way of making sure we have that communication from folks and the fact that we can explain what the plan is all about, because still I think there's a need to explain different parts of the plan, especially after it's adopted. I know we've had work sessions to try to iron out some of the issues, but I think we should continue with some thought of some other sessions after implementation to make sure folks understand it and there's a line of communication. I know we have an opportunity within 5 years to review it and address any changes, but I think it should be an ongoing communication somewhere in the plan to address that we have with folks out there to make sure they understand it and get input.
Felicia.
Thank you for your work on this section. This obviously is the one that was of most importance to me, and it's unfortunate. I think I like the way Randy put it, that the intent in the law was plain, but there wasn't a lot of verbiage to it, and it is one of the key reasons why there is a Delta Council. And if we don't go long on this one, to stick with the sports metaphor, we're wasting a lot of money. I mean, I actually think that, and this may well be in the drafting of it, it is very important throughout the plan, I think, to tell more of a story. And you all have written great parts from the white papers and others, but this particular issue wasn't really laid out to talk about the different agencies that touch the Delta and how uncoordinated they are and what kinds of problems come from that. And then to be very specific on the things that the agencies can do to improve the co-equal goals and, frankly, stretch California's beneficial uses of the water we do have on all fronts. And I think we need to have very specific recommendations, more than we have right now in the plan, for what would create, even not a regulatory thing, about what would make all of this better if only agencies would do X. We should have recommendations for what the legislature should do. If we don't have the power to do it, we should have recommendations for what the governor should do. And I really like what Randy said about the importance of this forum, not just being people from each of the agencies, but at some regular interval having a public meeting that has the heads of the agencies, similar to the Strategic Growth Council, or there are a lot of these, the Ocean Protection Commission, et cetera. I mean, our ability that's different than so many other efforts, whether it was CalFed or you name it, is this transparency that we have out in public where people need to account for what they've done, and I think we should just go for it. So thank you for what you've done so far, and I look forward to working with you on making it even better. I think this should be the most robust part of the plan and the most compelling, so don't limit yourself.
Yeah, and just as an example, to get back to Councilmember Gray's point, I think maybe the Association of California Water Agencies comments said it best, that the actions of their alternative, really one of the ones that they had proposed, was that the primary thing the plan ought to do was establish necessary strategies to facilitate coordination among the agencies. But we see a similar message from the city of Antioch, and from water users in each part of the state. So I think there's a lot of support for this direction.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? I think that one is, here's how I kind of conclude. Okay, but subject to seeing what language and what plan you're actually developing. Yep. Is probably what I'd summarize from this discussion. Let's go to page number 2, covered actions and exemptions, which is issue number,
Right, so this covers 3, 4, and 5. And these were comments received, again, on the 5th staff draft from various entities, including Delta cities and counties and other agencies that have facilities in the Delta. These were the primary commenters that we... These comment themes pertain to chapters 1 and 3, and I've listed specific page numbers for chapter 3 where we can go back and see some of the language that the comments were addressing. So starting with number 3, these comments suggested that, or I guess told us, that there was a lot of confusion about the covered actions, including things such as how to determine significant impact and whether an action upstream or downstream of the delta is a covered action. So staff took a look at these types of comments. We agreed that clarification is needed, and in some cases better emphasis of existing language in the draft plan needs to be applied to bring that up, points that are in there to emphasize them better. So what we are suggesting as possible changes moving forward is first to refine the definitions of the co-equal goals, water supply reliability, and protect, restore, and enhance delta ecosystem. By refining the definitions of the co-equal goals, our hope is that this would provide additional means and information to help project proponents determine what significant impact or significance means. And I apologize, I get a little bit confused myself on some of these at this point. But in addition to refining the definitions with language that hopefully would help in determining significant impacts to the co-equal goals, we're also proposing that, again, the second part is language that's in the draft, but emphasizing better that only actions that occur in whole or in part within the delta are covered actions. Therefore, actions which take place entirely downstream or upstream of the delta would not meet the criteria of covered actions.
Okay, questions? Felicia?
Just a question. And I just tried to reread it beforehand. What about something that physically happens upstream or downstream but has a significant impact on the delta? Would you be excluding that? Or
punt over to Chris on this.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we've wrestled with that, but we've tried to provide some clarity over the course of at least the last 3 to 4 months in the Covered Action Workshop and elsewhere. We think the legislation is clear in the definition. It has to apply in whole or in part the delta, and if you look to specifically some of the legislative analyses behind the bill, it was clear that the legislature wasn't trying to include within that definition actions that occur entirely outside of the delta or Sassoon Marsh. So, for instance, in the upper watershed, if there's diversion in use, obviously there's going to be an indirect impact on the delta. We know that. Similarly, if it's in an export area and they're not reducing their reliance on the delta or they're doing other things, there could be an indirect impact on the delta. There has to be a tie to the delta geographically. We're trying to clarify that. We think that although there are indirect impacts, and this is one of the issues that the chair always raises, unfortunately, we don't think that we have jurisdiction to regulate that unless there's some nexus to a covered action. We've said all along that although we can make recommendations that the law be changed. We can do other things with regard to non-binding recommendations. But if it's wholly upstream or wholly downstream or outside of the delta, we don't think that it meets the definition of a covered.
Can I just to follow
Yes.
up? Go. What about a contract renewal for taking water out of the delta?
Well, we think that does have a geographical nexus. So, yes, that's the short answer.
So, downstream from the delta, if a project increases demand, is that a covered action?
If there's no geographical nexus, no.
Well, whether it would be more intense farming that would require demand more water, or building out of sizable number of homes, something that might increase demand in the service area south of the delta that relies in part on delta water, is that a covered?
Right, the answer is no. However, and we'll touch upon, and we have in the past, one of our water resource policy, I guess it's number 1 and number 2.
Page 82.
There is, the council has at least given us direction so far with regard to actions primarily south of the Delta that have a nexus to a covered action in the Delta, where that covered action actually has a significant impact in the Delta, but it's caused by some action outside south of the Delta. And again,
This
we'll
is,
talk
this is
about
the language that water exported from the Delta, transferred through the Delta, or water used in the Delta touches the Delta. And that is deeply controversial to the water development community, as you know.
But we've had the question often, what about something that we do in Southern California, housing development, that indirectly increases demand on the Delta?
But if as a result of those increased demands, Metropolitan or some other agency sought a water transfer from the Sacramento Valley, then that becomes the covered action.
The water transfer.
Not what caused the demand, but
exactly
the action. Okay. All right.
It could be a covered action.
Could be. No,
yes.
no, I get it. Okay. And then for upstream of the Delta, you referenced, but I wasn't clear, diversions that may or may not.
Diversion and use entirely upstream would not be. However, if there was a water transfer through the Delta, you'd have that geographical nexus, and the water transfer could be a covered action.
There's some language in the introductory chapter on the fifth draft. It's not regulatory language, but explanatory language, page 6 and 7, which is worth reading. In the Delta Reform Act, the legislature gave the council specific authority that did not include the ability to regulate those who exclusively use water upstream of the Delta. Although these users clearly influence the system, the Delta Plan's policies are only recommendations for those upstream users. And I have reluctantly come to the conclusion that that's probably the right statement, legally the right statement. As a matter of policy, it doesn't make much sense to me, but the statute is reasonably clear.
And we have heard that criticism, as you know, Mr. Chair, on almost all of the meetings that we've attended, workshops that we've hosted, listening sessions throughout the state, some of the criticisms, the heavy hand of government, the regulatory nature reaching down outside of the Delta to try to do something that over which you have no jurisdiction. Our message has been clear that we have jurisdiction over covered actions. Covered actions have a geographical nexus in the Delta or the Sassoon Marsh.
If there was a water agency in the mountain counties or in a water use area in Southern California or using water in the San Joaquin Valley that didn't raise this issue, I don't know who they were, because really the only variation in their letters is did they put it in bold or red or use multiple exclamation marks when they addressed the issue. It's been a very loud comment throughout
Randy.
the process.
But
I'm sorry.
you referenced, I think, Chris, the direct and indirect. But indirect impacts could be enormous. Something could occur upstream that diverts a great deal of water, potentially.
Absolutely.
From the Delta.
We hear those kinds of arguments with regard to Hetch Hetchy and other things. So.
But your advice is that if it's indirect, it's not a covered action.
Unless it meets the definition of a covered action, it's not a covered action. For the instances that we're talking about here, unfortunately, they wouldn't be. But that doesn't, again, stop you from making recommendations that the law should be changed. But yes, entirely outside.
I'm not making an argument. I'm just,
I'm
making
probably,
the rubble bounce.
Yeah.
It's in the introductory section, but you kind of restated it that if it doesn't have a nexus to the Delta and indirect ones are not the same thing as effect on the Delta.
Right.
It has to have a geographic impact, or it has to occur in whole or in part in the Delta.
And
There's
all
a
the other
geographic
things that are in the
nexus,
statute.
and all of the other things.
And it can't be an excluded act, an exempted action. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry. I was going to try to give some context to this particular box here and talk about maybe the problem that we're trying to address in the way that we're proposing to solve that problem.
Let's separate them into the significant impact issue, and then let's get to the upstream, downstream.
Okay. So all of this is driven by definition. We know we talk about the Delta Reform Act, the definition of a covered action. Joe's alluding to the criteria for which we're referring to them as threshold criteria, whether or not a proposed action meets the criteria to become a covered action over which you would have jurisdiction. That would require the state or the local agency to file the certificate of consistency. So again, one of the criteria, the threshold criteria, putting aside the geographic nexus, is whether or not the proposed action would have a significant impact on the achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals or a government-sponsored flood control program. I'm probably paraphrasing some of that, but it's the significant impact test. We heard from many stakeholders in our workshops. We've heard them here at our public hearings. We get letters that it's difficult for us as potential state or local agencies who are going to have to self-certify whether or not our proposed actions are covered actions, whether or not we have a significant impact on achievement of the one or both of the co-equal goals or government-sponsored flood control programs, unless you tell us what achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals or flood control programs actually looks like. So paint us a picture of what achievement looks like. Give us a little more definition of what a significant impact is, because just providing a definition of significant impact is good, and we had attempted to do that by looking towards CEQA and some of the guidance there. But unless you tell us what we're having a significant impact on, it makes it difficult for us to self-certify. And that, I think that for the most part we agree. At the same time, it's a very challenging and complex thing to distill down into a definition what achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals will look like. So that's the problem that we're trying to address. The statute is clear that state or local agencies have to self-certify. Those state and local agencies in turn are telling us, that's fine, help us. Help us to figure out whether or not we're going to have a significant impact. So what we're proposing is that we try to add some more meat to the bones, try to define or paint a picture of what achievement of the co-equal goals will look like. It's important for this provision, but it's fundamental for the entire Delta plan. And so I'll defer to Joe and to Dan and Cindy to talk about that. But that's really the guts of what this particular recommendation and proposal goes to. Meat on the bones of what achievement of the co-equal goals actually looks like. Tell us how you think we're going to get there. And then in turn we can decide whether or not our proposed actions are going to interfere with what you say is the way to get there. So does that make sense?
And it partly begins then by offering definitions for terms that aren't defined in the law or that are defined only so tersely that it's difficult, to get a picture of it. So we'll be offering suggested definitions for ecosystem restoration and water supply reliability, government-sponsored flood control project.
How do you avoid the pitfall of trying to define water reliability more clearly without getting caught up in the trap of everybody saying, well, that means I get all the water I want forever, and the other one says, no, the environment has to get all the water, and just write it so that I get what I want. How do you avoid that?
Well, and here's where, because Martha's not in the meeting today, I can't get into the details. I don't know, Joe, you may have a better recollection of exactly how we're proposing to do that in the plan.
Well, I think we're talking about a couple of things. We have 4 different layers of what that means. So for water supply reliability, exports from the Delta, we're talking about having a predictability index and being able to say, are people able to take what they're predicted to be able to take? Are they doing that? So that's actually complex and practice to develop, but something that you can do. It's also important that you think regionally in each of the regions, what are they doing to reduce reliance on the Delta by developing recycled water, stormwater capture, doing conservation. What are they doing regionally to do those kinds of programs? So the definition has different layers to it, and actually doing all of those layers is important to achieve a more reliable supply for the state of California, that co-equal goal. You have to do it statewide, you have to do it regionally in each of the regions of the state, and you need to do it in the Delta. So that's what we're thinking as we think about how to enhance that definition.
I'm in favor of it being done. I predict that it will be about as fruitless as the other conversations are if we're trying to have absolute certainty of what a water reliability is. As a matter of fact, I think page 68, your box on water supply reliability comes reasonably close. Means California must match its demands for and use of water to the available supply. That's not bad. I understand a lot of people think it isn't specific in identifying their preferences, but that's not a bad approach for a reliable water supply. I'm intrigued with the predictability index or whatever the thing's called, because in the conversations we've had about it before, predictability is not quite the same thing as what all the advocates want, which is a legally enforceable guarantee that they get what they want whenever they want it, and government has to somehow make it work. It is it's a management-oriented concept. That is a radical departure in water attitudes in California if it becomes adopted, and I think it has a lot of potential for civilizing the debate. It won't completely, but somewhat. Pat?
Chris, how are you going to define significant?
Well, I think that we've already attempted to define significant borrowing from the CEQA playbook. Obviously, it's a different focus under CEQA. It's a significant adverse impact on the environment, but there's a definition that we pulled. Again, it doesn't add as much clarity, perhaps, as many would want. It's using the word substantial instead of significant, but it looks towards the impact, in our case, on the co-equal goals. So the concern, though, that I think is the concern that we're trying to address here is not so much changing out words for significant as opposed to substantial, but it's what are you having a significant impact on? And we've heard consistently that unless you give us some more guidance on what you think the achievement of the co-equal goals looks like and how you think what the steps are that you think need to be taken to get there, we can't tell if our project is going to have an impact, whether or not it's significant or not, on the achievement of those co-equal goals. So that's what we're aiming to do.
On the, however you define significant, is that in something that's here with us now?
I believe it's in the fifth staff draft, and I'm not sure that...
You've on page 60 under policies in Chapter 3 governance, you've got at least one diamond point.
Yeah, you might want to read that.
In line 40, all covered actions must be fully transparent, disclosing all potentially significant adverse environmental impacts and feasible mitigation of those adverse impacts. That is a modification because the statute on covered actions does not say adverse impacts. It says significant impacts. Later in the statute, when you want to appeal a decision of a local or a state agency, the appellant must identify adverse impacts. And I defer to Joe, who was the only one around here, probably part of the discussion, but it wouldn't shock me that it was designed that way deliberately so that you put your net out, but an appeal could only be done by somebody who could show an adverse, or alleged to show an adverse impact. But this language adds adverse in.
On page 57 of the fifth staff draft, 57 lines 30 to 35. That's where we talk about what significant impact. We try to add some clarity in the fifth staff draft, and we're going to try to refine that even more in the sixth staff draft.
I can tell you that during discussions with stakeholders while the law was being drafted, they specifically referred to this provision about significance, and they talked about what it says in CEQA. So CEQA was, when the legislation was being drafted, people knew better than I did and told me, well, they thought that CEQA was very broad about this, and they were worried, but they knew that that's what it referred to. At least they believed that.
And that's elsewhere described somewhere enough.
Elsewhere described.
What's in CEQA?
The language that is in here actually comes from CEQA.
Really? Because this says the council, it defines significant impact by calling it an impact that will significantly affect the achievement. So if everybody's lived with that and knows what it means, and triers of fact can understand what significant is as opposed to insignificant, then
right.
I'm fine.
Right.
The reason for raising it is I wouldn't want us or somebody else, including potentially a judge, to be stuck on, well, is significant just something that's not insignificant?
Yeah, and I think in the sixth staff draft, although we don't have the language here, we actually proposed changing out a word. I think I mentioned the word substantial, which is some of the words that have been provided
that
to
sounds like bigger than a bread box.
By our CEQA council, right, based on, right. So you will actually see the language, and I apologize it isn't before you. We'll try to refine it.
Okay, and then the second part of this, the language you are suggesting on the upstream, downstream.
Right, and I think Cindy covered that pretty well. That was consistent stakeholder concern from some of the upstream and downstream users that we clarify expressly in bold somewhere in our plan. That
Can I just make a suggestion on language in your box 3, your second little bullet point, where you're suggesting only actions that occur in whole or in part within the Delta are covered actions. Well, that's not precisely true. They have to occur in whole or in part. They're by a state or a federal local agency. They affect one or more elements of the Delta plan, and they have a city. I mean, the problem with this phraseology is putting in language that only mentions one of the statutory criteria and does not mention the exemptions granted by the statute. That's just a drafting problem, or it could be explained by a footnote that includes the text, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, a good point. This is not verbatim language, and the verbatim language would be a lot.
And that relates also to the discussion we had earlier on water that is exported from the Delta, goes through the Delta, all of that. And so a phrase that says takes place entirely downstream or upstream, standing alone, unqualified, will be pointed to as, see, here's what we said, doesn't matter what the statute says. It does matter what the statute says. So I think you want to be very careful about this language.
Yeah, and the way that we propose to do it is similar to the way that we have it in the fifth staff draft. We'll have all of the threshold criteria listed, and then if there are any qualifications or clarifications needed, they'll go right under that threshold criteria. So hopefully there should be no uncertainty, but it will be.
Chris,
you will be the judge.
We talked about up and downstream. If you're in the Delta,
yes,
then what?
Yeah,
because
then
a lot of the comments you say came from Delta.
Sure.
Interests, counties, and
right. If you then potentially your project does have the geographical nexus, if it meets the other criteria, it may be a covered action.
Okay. I think the clarity though that we can offer to in-Delta agencies and other people who've got an interest is the additional definition. So that, we have examples of, well, how much what would it mean, what would a significant impact on water supply reliability be? If I build 50 houses, and so you've got 50 more homes connected to my water system, and I'm entirely taken out of the Delta, is that a significant impact? And so by defining what we mean by water supply reliability, we're looking for a balance between supply and demand, then I think we can get at that. That's not a use that's going to be so substantial that it'll throw that balance out of kilter. And so you could relatively easily make a determination that, oh, yeah, that's not significant. Well, I think
And that's just
that's
an
an
example
example.
and not your conclusion, because
No.
50 houses is a lot of houses.
it's a lot of houses, but it might not have a significant demand on the water supply reliability in a particular community.
Right, that's an example. It may have other impacts, but I think
Well,
Dan's point is well taken, and that's what Joe always raises. Look, we're talking about big projects here that have big impacts.
Well, but you're also trying to write it so that people don't piecemeal a big project the way some government agencies will piecemeal a bid to get below the threshold where they require competitive bidding and then say, ooh. So that's why the language you've included of directly, indirectly, or cumulatively on impacts, I think that's not quite the language. That tries to
I'm
address
sorry,
that question.
50 houses is a lot.
Pardon?
Absolutely, 50 houses is significant. If you try to say it's not, then we have a problem. That's my
I
feedback.
don't think we were trying to say that.
Well, I'm just saying it might be, one house might not be, 3 houses might not be, 50 houses is.
Where are we building these houses?
In the Delta.
Okay. Cindy, I think we didn't talk about item number 5 on page 3, which is related to this discussion. This is the CEQA specific or general exemptions. What are you guys up to on that?
So,
I guess that means she's looked maybe a little confused.
oh, no, I just had to take a minute to jump ahead to where we're at. So,
Go ahead.
make sure I get this correctly here. So, staff received these comments regarding exemptions for covered actions and requests for specific or general exemptions in addition to those that were listed in the statute. Some of the comments we received specifically asked that projects that qualify for CEQA exemptions also be exempt from consistency with the Delta Plan. Staff took a look at these and partially agreed with the comments and proposed the following change, which is to include some additional language. Again, this would be in Chapter 3, to the effect that projects, programs, and plans that are statutorily or categorically exempt under CEQA are unlikely to have significant impact on the co-equal goals or government-sponsored flood control programs, barring unusual circumstances. And again, I realize this is not verbatim. It's a bit out of context, so much as the box number 3 that we just described.
I want to talk a little more about this one. We actually went through the whole list, and there must be 200.
The whole CEQA list.
The whole
Yes.
CEQA list of exemptions, and Dan did a lot of the heavy lifting here, going through, looking at every single statutory or categorical exemption that there was. And there were 5 or 6 where we said, this may be something that we don't automatically want to exempt. I'll give an example. I'm sorry.
Like an NFL stadium, were they to put it in the Delta?
Well, the one that comes to my mind is general plan updates by the counties if they are implementing the resources plan from the Delta Protection Commission. And it may be when they're doing those general plan updates that we would want to make sure that those general plan updates are consistent with the Delta plan. And so that exemption's not one that we would probably want to give. But other than that, there are a few others, but that's the one that stuck out in my mind that is an exemption.
And this is a standard that officials that are using the categorical exemption process are already familiar with, because there's a general provision in the categorical exclusion process that you can't take advantage of them if there's unusual circumstances, and there's a whole list of what those circumstances might be in particular situations too. But it provides assurance to a wide range of activities that are very minor in terms of their ability to affect the Delta, that, you haven't got to go through this extra paperwork.
Don.
Just a question. any general plan amendment, even policy text that I'm aware of, always requires an environmental document of some sort. I don't know that they've ever, I can't recall a circumstance where they brought a general plan amendment, even that might be initiated to incorporate another plan, where that just comes through and the Department of Environmental Review and Assessment just gives it the exempt status. It doesn't, it has, at a minimum, it's had, a document's gone through a checklist and might very well have a document, a negative declaration associated with it. I can assure you just on a recent adopted general plan, which was many different items, but, the environmental document was as big as the general plan text itself. Not unlike some of the other things we've been talking about today as well, thousands of pages. Ours was order of magnitude of hundreds of pages. But I'm just, my curiosity is kind of piqued here because my understanding is the resource management plan will have to line up with the Delta plan, and our general plans will have to comport with both the Delta plan once it's adopted and the resource management plan. They already do with the current resource management plan. So just to move to your example, Joe, how is it that we would get out of sync on that with all that linkages even in the statute? How is it that using counties, for example, I don't know how we'd ever get around it anyway.
I think most local governments would just automatically comply with the Environmental Quality Act reporting requirements because they're so used to doing it. But there is a specific exclusion, and I think it's because the assumption is that, I have to think back to our time on the Protection Commission, but I believe there was an environmental impact report that we had to certify at the time we updated the Natural Resources and Land Use Plan. And
There's
so
a nod from behind you in the audience.
I think the presumption is that, the CEQA's already been handled by the Delta Protection Commission, so now the local governments can rely upon that certification.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So you could stack it. The argument could be stacked using the first document to get all the way. Although that's again,
it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, my experience is
so,
that way.
And that's why we're talking about this.
The other thing we're dealing with in the Delta plan that is different is this 85022 code section. Intent of the legislature that state and local land use actions identified as covered actions be consistent with the Delta plan. The section's findings, policies, and goals apply to Delta land use planning and development. And that just kind of, that just pops up in the law, and it puts a gloss on this discussion that's a little different than the normal CEQA comparability discussion. Okay.